Then the next thing is value. I would say this is the challenge that I'd want you to think about, maybe even step one, in fact. Before you even build your first feature, what problem is it that you're solving, and who are you solving it for? And how significant is it? Is it really, really important? This is the subject of a whole workshop in of itself, the value proposition workshop. But I'll just say something that's so critical to the thinking here. Remember when we first heard Greg's invention, we went, wow, 3D. That's huge. I mean, that must be enormous. We all inherently think, things must be 3D because we live in a 3D world. But 12 years later, you are still seeking the market, right? I want to ask you a challenging question, because I know, is Gordon here from MIT? Gordon, did you join us? Yeah, he does, great. Gordon is not to pull you up out of the blue, Gordon is somebody who's looking at developing a 3D product, and I know you're advising him. Do we know what market there is for 3D yet? Seriously, I mean, it's a big challenge. Yeah, go ahead.
So, yeah, sometimes people ask me, well, if I had the money to do it right or the cheapo technology to do it again, what market would we look at? As far as I know, the only successful auto-stereoscopic display market are these handheld gaming devices, the Nintendo 3DS, and maybe viewfinders for 3D cameras. But I still think that given a cheap enough core technology, all of the markets that we were looking at become open again, because the barrier to sale is much lower, and they might buy it for a novelty, or maybe I'll get lucky and have a return on investment.
So I think that's, sorry, question.
But I just want to add one point before you ask that question. So a real difficulty we had through the life of the company in assessing if a market was a good fit was that for visual products, we couldn't figure out how to demonstrate an idea or get meaningful feedback unless we built the thing.
Right.
I couldn't figure out how to send a smart marketing person in to ask questions, because invariably everyone would imagine liking a hologram, but it wasn't until they saw it that their answers became meaningful.
Yeah, yeah. So the paper prototype didn't work in your case. Right. This is the thing that I want to get clear, first of all, is that if you don't know what problem you're solving and you're not clear that it's valuable, we're in trouble right there. And so this is why we don't want to be in the situation where we just invent technology or find some breakthrough and get all excited about it. And in particular, what I want you to try to do, even before you go anywhere near building your minimum viable product, is just ask yourself this question. Do you have a problem that, if you solve it, is really valuable? Because a minimum viable product is irrelevant if it doesn't solve a valuable problem. And to be specific, viable does not mean valuable. They are two very distinct things. And I see way too many people caught up in this, I've got a great MVP, but what problem does it solve? I don't know. Well, then you really don't have anything. So it's this valuable piece that's so important. Now, in the workshop on what is effectively the value proposition, we talk a little bit about how do you qualitatively value this. And my simplest recommendation to you, if you haven't watched that workshop, is just do a before and after scenario. And the before and after should answer what Greg was getting at, which is, okay, if somebody didn't have a 3D display before and then they had it afterwards, what did that mean? Did that mean that they had some little bit of joy, or did they relieve some incredibly chronic pain? And afterwards, they ended up with incredible joy. Well, as you can tell, Greg did actually end up focusing on a marketplace where that potentially could have panned out, which was in the medical world, where literally removing people's brain tumors could have been incredibly valuable. But it's not an easy thing to do this, and it's what you really need to focus on very early on. Now, we're lucky to have Abby Fickner with us, who's actually just recently done a workshop on Agile Validation. Well, actually, validation. I call it Agile Validation, and I'll come back to that. But the validation piece is a very important part of this, because you don't want to guess this stuff. You want to get out of the building and figure out what the customers are for this particular proposition and understand why they think if they buy this, they will get incredible joy. Now, there's an important thing Greg said earlier on, which is, by the way, selling is an important piece of your validation, but how you sell and who you sell to is also extremely important. So you mentioned, for example, Greg, that you sold to researchers, and that turned out to not really be a big market, right? This is a big issue. Lots of small companies find what might be what I would describe as the mirage markets. Mirage markets are all over the place. Research labs is a classic one. You really don't have a market until customers are paying for something. And trust me, even if you think freemium is a great strategy, we'll talk about it later on, in the end, your validation needs to be dollars. And then Greg said something really important, which is it's even more important, even when they start paying for it, to ask this question about why. Why are they paying for it? What is it that they've said, I'm going to actually spend money on this for? And until you understand that problem, you haven't done any validation. So I'm not going to recreate all the great work. I encourage you to go look at Abby's talk, which gives you a lot of the great tools for going and doing this. My favorite one is still, for all the landing pages and web prototypes and surveys you might do, go get yourself some prepaid customers. If a customer is willing to write you a check for you to actually deliver something, then they've probably got a real pain. And Kickstarter, for example, is in effect doing that. But obviously, it's just in a little different form. It's in a crowdfunded form. So I mentioned value proposition. You can find it on the site. There's one other piece for you to really understand tonight that I use a lot, which is what I call the gain-pain validation. And that is to say, you really need to understand not just the gain you're giving your customer, but the pain they have to go through to actually get that gain. So Greg gave a perfect example of this. If, as he came up and answered that question, if 3D displays were, $100 and they were incredibly easy to plug in to everything we did every day, then I'm sure we'd all use them. In effect, the gaming market has, in fact, done that. They've found a way to make it easy enough for people to get on their Nintendo or whatever it is, a 3D display that actually gives some value, whether it's just fun or entertainment, and at a lower cost enough price. And so that's the pain piece. If Greg could have reduced, I'd see him nodding, all the pain of producing that display down to $100, you probably would have opened up a whole bunch of markets. And I bet there will be some 3D markets that will open up. This would have been the Greg Center, and maybe it will be in the future. So that's what we want the rest of you to figure out, is how do you become part of the Greg Center? So the next thing I hear is people have what I would describe as multifaceted value props. And what are multifaceted value props? Well, here's an example. One of the companies that came in to pitch us this week, actually they're already an investment of ours, is selling security solutions, password solutions. And on the one hand, they sell these to e-commerce sites like Demandware and to banks that need secure login. On the other hand, those people aren't really the customer. The real customer is the consumer who logs into those sites, to either buy goods or to do transactions. So they've got a very challenging problem. They've got to get both the consumers excited about their solution, and yet they've got to have the merchants enabled or the banks enabled to actually make that solution really work. That's a multifaceted value proposition. That's tough. What if you could just pick a problem and say, look, if I solve this problem for you, produce, for example, a product that makes it possible for you to check interference on any engineering part you ever do in 3D, and by the way, as simply as you ever drew in 2D, would that be valuable? I guess so, is the answer that John's going to share with you later. And you've got one customer, the engineer or the designer or whoever it is, and you've got one value prop. And I really encourage you, because I hear this so often, to not get caught in this. If you've got multiple audiences, pick one and find one starting value proposition for you. Okay, again, just to reduce that whole value prop section to this next piece, there are a lot of things we talk about. For those of you who've been in the session, finding discontinuous, defensible, disruptive innovation, for example, and then finding markets where it's unworkable, unavoidable, and it's urgent. But there's also one piece that I want to bring out, which is, where is it underserved? Where is the marketplace not being well served for the problem that you might develop? And then this leads to what we're going to talk about now. How do you target that and segment it? So Greg already brought this up, and most people talk in terms of product market fit. What I'm hoping to do in the next 5 or 10 minutes is to show you that product market fit is not a simple thing. It's actually very important to double click on it and figure out actually go-to-market fit. So in Greg's case, I think he talked about this whole idea of coming up with market segments. And how many years were you into your business when you realized that this was important?
Well, we weren't all dumb, but
yeah.
So we listed them on day one,
Yeah.
but we didn't understand the true complexity of a lot of them until year 3 or 4.
Yeah.
For example, the word medical imaging is actually diagnostic, interventional, and then 10 subspecialties under that.
Exactly. It's segments within segments within segments. And this is the thing I'm going to encourage you to do. When you look at product market fit, don't think about your market as medical. Think about it as medical imaging and then go down into the next segment, until you can really figure out what is the basis on which to target your product. So when you talk about minimal viable product, yeah, you might shrink your product down to a small piece, but it's still, unless you've figured out which segment to go after, a large area for that product to cover. And so it's all about trying to find this fit. So it's actually hard to put this up in pure simple graphics. So I'm going to actually use the whiteboard to do this with you, and then we'll use my slide afterwards. So actually, let me steal one of these ones here so we can keep Greg's stuff up. So the idea that I want you to think about is as follows. If you could find a bullseye to initially target, and the bullseye was incredibly well defined, was very tightly defined, and your product perfectly mapped it, then you would have a product market fit. And if you could keep that as a consistent fit as you went customer after customer, then you'd be very successful. But usually what I see is this. People define their MVP. They say they've got this marketplace, for example, medical. And now they go out and they start talking to customers. They find one over here, one over here, one over here, maybe one over here, one over here. Which one do you pick? Which one's right? And if you just go down the typical process that most people go down, what they'll do is they'll start building features for this person, start building features for this one, maybe pick a few there, and pretty soon what happens to your minimum viable product? It starts becoming a pretty big product. It adds a lot of features, a lot of functionality. And what you've really done is just expand your need for resources, the one thing you don't have lots of. You don't have enough engineers, you don't have enough cash. You're trying to actually conserve that until you get to some repeatability. So what I want you to do is this. I want you to do the exact opposite. I want you to look at every single one of these guys and say, what is their need? What's their pain? And how can I find one or two of these that line up, that actually have exactly the same pain and need? And when you do that, two things happen. Number one is your product, as you move to match those needs, doesn't change. So now you don't have to expand the footprint of your product. And number two is your roadmap for your business about how you meet those needs is completely consistent. You'll find the same channels to go after them, the same messaging and positioning, the same tactics, and so forth. And I purposely drew this on a diagonal because the mistake that most people make is to say, oh, a vertical or a segment, oh, that must be SMB, or maybe it's medical versus government, or maybe it's financial versus consumer, whatever. The reality is it sometimes doesn't fit neatly like that. It's actually sometimes completely different to that. It might be people who have a specific, for example, compliance need, and compliance might work across, for example, pharma and financial services. In fact, it might be anybody, just to give you an example, who has the need to trade derivatives. And that's actually any Fortune 1000 company that does anything internationally. So it may fit across multiple verticals. And so the point about a segment is it may be unique to your particular product, and it may not be neatly defined. So I'll try to just show this to you on a slide so you can get beyond my handwriting. So we're trying to avoid this stretch, this fit and stretch problem that first occurs by trying to go after too many needs that are dissimilar to start off with. And instead what we're trying to find is a product market fit solution where every one of these needs that you identify is the same. And at that point, you have what I call a minimum viable segment. So the minimum viable segment can be tested very simply. It gets tested by, do things repeat without you having to change your product and change the way you go to market? If they do, you've found a segment. And what I mean by repeat is literally customer by customer, can you meet their needs? And as you repeat your product, does it say the same? And if it does, you're onto a winner. You're now going to be able to continue to move this business forward without adding more cash, adding more engineers, trying to change your marketing every time you go out to market. And it's a tremendously magical thing because another great thing comes out of it. You get referenceability. You start to dominate this segment where now with 1, 2, or 3 customers who all have the same needs, who can talk to each other and say, yeah, I'm getting the same benefit as you, you start to become known as the leader in this segment. And because it's not big, hopefully you've been nice and defined about it, you can dominate it really early on and quickly define yourself as being the market leader for 3D CAD/CAM in whatever it might be, engineering and so forth. And that's what we want to get you to. We want to get you to a place where early on as a startup, you're starting to have traction.